good evening, and welcome. Tonight, I'll be teaching you a very brief history of Sudan. I don't have any bonus extras to show you because I'm going to actually have a whole video devoted to bonus extras. So this video's just going to be a brief summary of the history of Sudan. I apologize for any cars going by. As always, I'll always edit out the loudest ones. I tried filming this last night, but there was like a loud car parade or something going on. I don't know. I didn't feel like having cuts every 30 seconds, so I'll try again, but that's okay. So Sudan. Again, I always like to start my country deep dives into thinking what you already know about the country. And very sadly, what Sudan is most famous for in these modern times is something very atrocious and just a horrific crime against humanity, unfortunately. So we will touch on it. I will be delicate about it because this is a relaxation video. And like I said in my last video, every country has had some sort of horrific event happen in it, right? So just remember that even though some governments are not very good, some leaders are very bad people, that doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of the population are horrible people. Sudan's actually an interestingly diverse country in that besides the Sudanese people, it does have a large population of many indigenous tribes and some nomadic tribes as well, traveling around the deserts, living off the land. The most famous geographical aspect of Sudan is, of course, the Nile River, probably the most famous river in the world. The Nile starts way down here, way beyond what you can see on the screen. It starts down in the Lake District near Burundi, flowing through Lake Victoria, and then all the way up here in the White Nile. And it also starts in Ethiopia over here in Lake Tana, just right there. Get the pencil so you can see. Better pointer. And it flows up through the Blue Nile, and they both converge in the capital city of Khartoum, where it becomes the Nile River. It flows up through Egypt very famously and out into the Mediterranean. Also very geographically famous in Sudan is the Nubian Desert, where our story's going to begin in this area here along the river in the desert. The Nubian Desert is named after the nomadic Noba people that eventually settled into this region. But during ancient times, the people that lived here were known as Nubians. But before we get into the history, there's one little thing I want to touch on before I forget to do it, and that's some interesting things about the borders of the country. Now, we're going to talk about the southern border later in the video because it may change in the near future, but I want to touch on what's going on up here on the northern border. So this region right here is called the Halaib Triangle, and it's currently claimed by both Egypt and Sudan. It doesn't seem to be like a huge conflict issue, but a touchy one nonetheless because both countries want this land. But then there's this region right here. It's called the Beard's Wheel, and neither Egypt nor Sudan claim this part of the desert. And that's because nobody lives there. It's considered the last space on Earth that is habitable but uninhabited. And I think that's really cool. But anyway, let's dive into first, we talk about where Sudan gets its name. So Sudan comes from the Arabic phrase Balad as-Sudan, which means land of the blacks. And That's mainly because Egypt and Sudan have a very closely tied history, and typically people up here are lightly brown, and people down here are darkly black. So the concept of Sudanese people derived from the Arab Muslims that eventually moved into Egypt and took control and referred to the people down here as Sudanese because they were blacker than them. And eventually the region was called Sudan. But going way back into history, and I mean way back, way back, to very early man, just after the Ice Age, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. Sorry, it's apparently another parade of loud cars night. But the early people who wandered this land as nomads, hunter-gatherers, in the desert region, which wasn't as terribly deserted as it is now, realized that the Nile River flooded every year around the same time. And once the waters receded, it left behind soil that was very rich and very fertile. And they figured that they can plant seeds in that soil, grow crops, and harvest the crops in time for the next flood season to come, which would leave behind fertile soil for them to repeat the cycle. And farms sprung up all down the Nile River. This very famously happened in Egypt, but it also happened down here in the Nubian Desert. There was a reason, though, that the Egyptian culture and the Nubian culture did not meet, and that is because the Nile River has something called cataracts. Cataracts are, think of like raging rapids, rocky portions of fast-flowing water that pretty much prevent any kind of rafts or boats from going up the river. And the first cataract was right around the border here of modern Egypt and Sudan. So it kind of cut off these two cultures from ever really meeting for a couple thousand years. But they still developed the same kind of farming techniques. The earliest settlements in Sudan around the Nile come from around 8,000 BCE. That's how long ago we're talking. And I thought, that's way too early. It's so early for human history. But I kept looking up sources, and sure enough, that's how long ago it was. The very dawn of human civilization started around this river, and a few other rivers in the Middle East and India, and, other coastal regions around the world. But it was around rivers like the Nile that farms and little towns sprung up. And when you get farms and towns, you get civilization. You get communities. You need people to control these communities to make sure everything is going okay for everyone that lives there. And once you get leaders who make sure everything's okay, you eventually get rulers, kings and queens. That definitely happened down here. And the name of the kingdom that sprung up around the Nile in Sudan was known as the Kingdom of Kush. I've seen it pronounced Kush, Kush, all sorts of different ways. I tend to alternate in between, so don't be too bothered by it. I try to say Kush with hush, but I'll use both. It'll just slip out. The Kingdom of Kush was firmly established by 1700 BCE. And I'm actually going to, like I said, this is a very brief summation of the history of Sudan. The Kingdom of Kush has this very long, complicated, but beautiful history, and I'm going to have a whole video devoted to it. Actually, technically 2 videos, you'll see, it's a surprise. But just for the sake of the brief history of Sudan, this is a brief history of the Kingdom of Kush. So, in a nutshell, the Egyptian Empire up here was much more advanced and powerful compared to the very ancient Kingdom of Kush. And they conquered and sort of wiped out the little cities that were built along the Nile down here. The Egyptians built their own little towns, they wound up withdrawing back to Egypt. So the kingdom slowly began to prosper once again, with their own customs mixed in with the customs that the Egyptians left behind. They combined religions, architecture, and just various ways that they lived their lives. And at one point, the kingdom of Kush was far more powerful than the kingdom of Egypt. Egypt was going through a weak point. And the kings of Kush conquered Egypt. And it was known as, Egypt and Kush, the two kingdoms that were one. For a brief moment of time, the kings of Kush ruled as pharaohs in Egypt. And this was actually a very welcoming thing for the Egyptians. They did not mind, because the Kushites were very similar to them and were very much about preserving the Egyptian culture and way of life. So it was not like a fierce takeover. It was a very welcome one. And it was actually a very peaceful and prosperous time for both kingdoms. Slowly, the kingdom of Kush pushed past their boundaries, past where you can't see, into this region over here, kind of near modern Israel. And they brushed up against the Assyrian Empire in Assyria. And if you know your ancient history, you know the Assyrians were some of the most fiercest warriors. Very, very, how do I say it? Like, if you push them, they'll shove back. They were warriors for sure. So they pushed back against the Kushites and conquered Egypt, and actually pushed Kushites back out of their territory down to their new capital city called Meroe. The Kushites once again had another period of prosperity after rebuilding their old capital city. They built lots of pyramids. We'll go over it in the next video, I promise. They eventually went and recaptured Egypt from the Assyrians, but then the Assyrians pushed back and wiped them out once again and withdrew from the region. I think I'll have to pencil mark. Oh no, at least it's my book. This pretty much devastated both kingdoms, and neither fully recovered. Alexander the Great came into Egypt and took it over and revamped it and left Ptolemy in charge. But the kingdom of Kush was never the same after this. Eventually it dissolved after being conquered by smaller and smaller tribes. But again, they eventually reformed. We're now in the CE. Forgot to say the years. Kush took Egypt in 800 BCE and ruled for quite a while. But Kush wasn't gone until the early century of CE. Eventually, by the 5th century CE, some new kingdoms had sprung up around the Nile River. Here we had Nobatia, this region, and down here we had Alodia. But more importantly was the kingdoms over here, much larger, much more powerful, called Makuria. To the point where Makuria eventually absorbed Nobatia. And what was unique about these countries was that, or countries, kingdoms, what was unique about them was that by the 6th century, they were Christian kingdoms, and Christianity sort of crept into the region and took hold. And this wasn't nearly like the Christianity that was going on in Europe at the time. Very unique form of Christianity, but Christianity nonetheless. This time the Byzantine Empire was in control of Egypt, and they were taken over by the Arabs, who were Muslim at the time. And in 641 and 642, the Arabs tried to conquer Makuria, but failed. They tried again in 652, but failed. So Makuria and the Arabs of Egypt signed a non-aggression pact to kind of rule side by side. That actually worked out for them very well. But sadly, the Makurian kingdom suffered a civil war in 1365 and never really recovered from it. Their capital city, which was Dongola, you can see right there, was destroyed during the civil war. It had completely collapsed by 1484, and a the people that lived in this region, traveled upriver looking for a new place that wasn't destroyed from civil war, and they met up with a group of people who were traveling downriver from Ethiopia, and they met up sort of in the middle in this section here between the White Nile and the Blue Nile. These people were called the Funj people, and they started a new kingdom called the Kingdom of Sennar, which you can see Sennar right there, and it was basically here in the borders of the river, and it was very prosperous, and it was a combination of the Muslim faith and the Christian faith. Very diverse, interesting culture they had there. And that was in 1504, because in 1526 the Ottomans invaded Suakin. You can see right there, Suakin, and slowly started creeping west, so that by 1585 they had reached Dongola and clashed with the Kingdom of Sennar eventually. But it was a standstill. It was pretty evenly matched, and they both agreed to just kind of let the Ottomans rule this part, and they could keep their land. Fortunately, there was a coup in 1718 in the kingdom, and it changed their culture. It really enforced a more Sharia law style of Islam. Really ended any of the Christian aspects of their culture, and it wound up weakening the kingdom overall. You can kind of see where it's going. There's a pattern here between kingdoms growing strong and then weak and strong and then weak, but this was very notable. Speaking of, over here in the Darfur region were many nomadic tribes that would settle, come into power, reign for a couple hundred years, fall apart, and then someone else would come in and reign for a couple hundred years. So at this point in history, it was the Furukira Sultanate. So this was also a very Islamic region, not as strict as over here, but Islamic nonetheless. So just important to note that basically what we know as Sudan today was pretty Islamic. Now, side note, the Ottomans eventually wound up taking over Egypt, and in 1821 they captured Sudan, took it over, and they actually, besides implementing their culture, built roads, improved the infrastructure, and built lots of very successful farms that are still in operation today. So it was in Ottoman control for quite a while. Meanwhile, the Suez Canal was built right here in 1869. You can barely see the Suez Canal right there. It's a very, very important canal in history because it allowed merchant ships coming from Asia not to have to sail around Africa to reach Europe. They could just sail right into the Red Sea, go up to the Mediterranean. So the great powers of Europe, particularly England, were very invested in the Suez Canal. And they knew that it was very important to keep close ties with Egypt and not do anything that would make them displeased and, even start a war or cut off any kind of access to the Suez Canal. So they became little buddies, basically. And when there was a revolt in Egypt in 1882, the English stepped in and, helped them with that and implemented a pro-British ruler into Egypt. This becomes important later, I promise. Meanwhile, in the Nubian desert was a new Islamic movement springing up. It was led by a man who called himself the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I, which means the guided one. So his followers were called the Mahdists. And I know when I say that it sounds like the word modest, M-O-D-E-S-T, but don't think of it like that. The Mahdists. And the Mahdi, I should say, was named Muhammad Ahmed ibn Abdallah. And he was a very, very influential, powerful leader of these people. And eventually got them to rise up and take control of Khartoum, which had become the capital, and eventually all of this region. He took over control of Khartoum in 1885 and actually died 6 months after he took it over, but he had such a powerful network of followers and successors that they continued his vision and ruled in the same way he would. He was also very strict about a Sharia law style of Islam over the people. And they were very, very strong and powerful actually for quite a while. They even invaded Ethiopia in 1887 and attempted to invade Egypt, but failed. And they eventually had to withdraw from Ethiopia a few years later because the Belgians and Italians had colonies here along the shores and they were feeling threatened, so they fought back with their European style of fighting. Then eventually the British stepped in and invaded Sudan in 1896 in what was known as the Modest War, sort of as revenge for them conquering Khartoum, which was technically owned by them because it was being controlled by the Egyptian Ottomans. The British were successful in the Modest War. They won in 1898. They were led by General Sir Herbert Kitchener. And in 1899, Sudan was officially declared a crown colony of England. You can see it would be these borders all down here. It became controlled by England, but they left control with the Egyptians, thinking that the Egyptians would moderate the government and make sure everything was going smoothly. And then the Egyptians were moderated by Britain, making sure everything was going smoothly. Egypt was okay with this at the time because they eventually planned to conquer all of Sudan and make it part of Egypt. So they were just kind of like, for now this is fine because we want to eventually control all of Sudan. Now around this time was when a split happened between North and South Sudan, and that's because of the British rule. The people in the north, particularly around Khartoum, were very resistant to British rule and fought back a lot in more ways than one. But the people of the south were just kind of okay with it. They started implementing more Christian values into their daily life, whereas up here it was more pro-Islamic. So that divide sort of started. In 1925, the Egyptians and Britain set up the Sudan Defense Force, which was basically volunteer Sudanese who would help try to keep the peace in this region. Which was kind of a good and bad thing because, once you form a militia like that, it's not always the best idea. But they wound up being very useful in World War II because the Italians attempted to invade Sudan, thinking that if they came through Sudan, they could get to Egypt. But the Sudan Defense Force was the front line against that invasion, and they were successful. However, the Sudan Defense Force wound up mutinying against the government of Sudan in the 1950s because of the oppression that the southern Sudanese were starting to experience. They felt very underrepresented in the government, that their voices weren't being heard. And people up here that agreed with them began a civil war between the two regions. Now, by this point, Egypt had a revolution in 1952, and the government was very weak itself, so they eventually just gave up the idea of taking over Sudan. It's not important. And Britain really saw Sudan as a liability because of the unstable civil war and government. It was just, they didn't want to be held responsible or start another war right after they had had such a long, arduous one. So Egypt and Britain left it up to the people of Sudan, told them they could have a vote whether they could remain a British colony or become an independent country. And sure enough, on January 1st, 1956, Sudan officially became its own country, independent. They attempted to stay as democratic as possible, considering the instability of the government. This will be a common theme you'll see. You saw it in the last video with Haiti, when a new government is suddenly left on its own, and it's not entirely stable. It leads to military coups, and you'll see it in next week's country as well. It's a common theme. So the government was eventually overthrown in a coup in 1969. And the government became very Marxist, very no parties, just very strict government. And actually they had a coup in 1971 from the Communist Party, but was only successful for a few days before they were re-overthrown by the old government. So it was a pretty unstable time. But the one big successful coup that happened in Sudan was on June 30th, 1989, when the government was taken over in a bloodless coup by Omar al-Bashir, who was a general. And Omar al-Bashir was a very strict authoritarian leader, a very big believer in implementing Sharia law and having total control over the population. And his reign lasted for a very long time. Of course, the southern Sudanese people rose up against him constantly, and it actually was the start of a second civil war that stretched on until 2005. It's technically the longest civil war in history. Omar al-Bashir ruled a little deceptively. He would, make a lot of broken promises, promising to improve the country and then changing his mind. In 2000, there was an attempt to get someone else on the ballot because he would do things like hold elections and only have himself on the ballot. So when an opponent came forward to challenge him, he had him imprisoned so that he couldn't be on the ballot, and things like that. And then in 2003 was when the Darfur crisis began. Now, the Darfur region was filled with many different little villages and towns, nomads, lots of little cultures, and for the most part they were Islamic, but they were not al-Bashir's form of Islamic, not following his aspects. So he basically, and his government, funded a militia, I forgot the word, a militia, a very vicious gang who call themselves the Janjaweed, to basically go through and remove the people of Darfur. And it was a humanitarian crisis, honestly. It led to millions of refugees, millions dead, irreparable damage in the region. Of course, there was international outrage, very famously so. The International Criminal Court of the United Nations issued an arrest warrant for al-Bashir and the leaders of the Janjaweed. And he would do those broken promises again, promising to scale things back, and then wouldn't, then he'd get in trouble again, and then he'd make promises to ease the tension, and then he would rescind those. It was a very messy time. So meanwhile, during all of this, the southern Sudanese were still fighting against his regime. So a lot of African nations worried about the instability. The UN and pretty much, any kind of worldwide organization that wanted to end the unrest in the region met up, and they came to a agreement to end the civil war on January 9th, 2005. And it was basically just for the southern region of Sudan to just kind of sit out all politics involved in Khartoum from al-Bashir. Just let them kind of control and vote on things themselves. And then in 2011, they would have a vote on whether or not they wanted to rejoin the country. So they did have that vote in 2011, and basically every region of South Sudan voted to leave. It was like a 98% of the population voted to leave Sudan. So South Sudan, as of now, is the newest country in the world, founded in 2011. And we'll talk about them in another video. Things were not that great in Sudan for quite a while. In 2018, prices started to skyrocket on essential items, and there were protests against al-Bashir, and his government answered that with firing on the protesters, which led to more protests, which led to more violence, which led to protesters that were killed. And the protests reached such a high point that in April 2019, the main organization that was protesting managed to overthrow and arrest Omar al-Bashir. And actually, his trial started in July 2020. He's been house arrest all this time. And he's, on trial for the murder of the protesters and also for embezzlement of government funds that were discovered after he was overthrown. And once that trial wraps up, he's going to be sent to The Hague to undergo a trial for his crimes against humanity for the Darfur region. So his day is coming. So since he was overthrown, a very democratic government was put in place. Their current prime minister is named Abdallah Hamdok, and he is doing a lot to implement lots of positive changes in the region. He has, for example, he has women on his, board leading the country, even Christian women leading the country alongside him. In July 2020, they abolished things like female genital mutilation, flogging, public beatings. Women are allowed to travel places without asking their husband first. On the LGBT side, anal sex is no longer a death sentence, but just imprisonment. Baby steps on that front. But basically, Sudan is on the up and up very slowly, and things are changing in this region very recently. So we'll have to keep an eye on the government of Sudan and see if they make any other changes toward democracy. It's sort of an exciting time. We'll see what happens with al-Bashir's trial. So, as I said, that was a very brief history of Sudan. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me check my notes, make sure I actually got everything. Yeah, pretty much. Just one last note is that in the mountains here in the Darfur region is where you can find the highest point in the country. It's called the Dariba caldera, and it is a volcano. But it's very extinct. It has 2 lakes in it. There's still a lot of hot springs in the region around it, but it's a very extinct volcano. The scientists think that the last eruption was about 60,000